Here is a picture from 1960. This picture was taken on 11 April 1960. It was taken at the place that burnt down 2 years ago in Marshalltown. Do you remember when 77 people died in Johannesburg? When it was called a hijacked building. That's the term they use in the media. But this very building, this is where 77 people died 2 years ago. They burned to death in this very building. This picture from 11 April is a picture of Africans queuing to get the hated pass. These same Africans had thrown away their dome passes during the Defiance campaign. So this is after the Defiance campaign. They had thrown away their passes, they burnt them. So even history will remember Africans burning the passes during the Defiance campaign. This event is after the Defiance campaign. They have burnt their passes, they hate them, and yet here they are queuing for the passes. This, for me, preoccupies, obsesses, and fascinates me. Would you queue for harm? Because the dome pass is the exemplar of harm. But would you stay in a queue for harm? Would you queue for harm? Ayabulela, would you queue for harm? Right? Lutando, would you queue for harm? You have just defied it during the Defiance campaign. You have burnt your dome pass. And here, 11 April 1960, you're queuing at number 80 Albert Street, Marshalltown, Johannesburg.
It's quite interesting what Professor Mboti is suggesting, that we need to study or look or develop a framework that will help us to understand from the queue line, or from the reason why I'm interested in it is because I'm in the queue line. I relate more with the person who will, even though we hate the system, we still feed the system.
To everyone who has joined, we are 17 strong, so I think we can begin. And everyone else who's late will join us afterward, but we do have our two guests present with us. And so I'd first like to introduce myself to those of you who may not know me. My name is Ayabulela Mhlahlo. I'm a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Connecticut, but more importantly, I am a long-standing member of the BlackHouseKollective, and myself and Comrade Zwelenkani are basically in charge of the BHK Philosophizing in Soweto Series. So welcome to the Philosophizing in Soweto Series. This is our digital platform where we host a variety of scholars, philosophers, theorists, as well as activists in Azania writ large, as well as just the African world in its totality, who are doing groundbreaking work that is fundamental, not only as a response to, oppressive systems that African people and Black people's the world over face, but also as a way in which we can capacitate ourselves intellectually in order to build the frameworks and the blueprints for a new oncoming world, which is the prophecy, of course, of our intellectual forebearers. I will read to you what we are as BHK, and then I will also introduce our speakers and also introduce the topic of today. So the program is my introduction. That will be followed by a 20-minute presentation by Professor Mboti, who is the founder of Apartheid Studies, and we're very honored to have Professor Mboti as the establisher and pioneer of something that will be really important in the 21st century as we begin to think about apartheid its continuums as not only periodical, but more importantly, epochal, defining of a political time and defining of political patterns which we perpetuate in our game of politics and power. He will be followed by our second guest, who is Mr. Samkelo Ndlovu, a PhD student at the University of Witwatersrand, who is the leader, effectively, of what they call the Critical Apartheid Studies Thinking and Reading Group. And they have hosted, I think now it's 2 international conferences. And Mr. Ndlovu will have about 15 minutes to respond to Professor Mboti's answer of the question, what is apartheid studies in our times, and how the critical framework of apartheid studies, which him and his peers are establishing, sort of responds to some of the questions that Professor Mboti has established, and how it might even expand those questions using other rigorous tools and multidisciplinary tools. We will then open up the discussion to the House, to the audience, for a 45-minute discussion. I will facilitate, of course, and we will then close it off with closing remarks from our speakers. So the BHK Philosopher in Soweto series has relaunched its platform with a new wave of hybrid and online intellectual symposiums and public lectures by esteemed global philosophers and Azania's young generation of groundbreaking scholars. We have been honored to host esteemed scholars like Professor C.K. Raju, Professor Oyoronke Oyewumi, Professors Louis R. Gordon, Professor Nelson Maldonado Torres, the late Professor Charles Mills, Professor Mabocha More, Professor Mukhobe Ramose, Sadia Hatman, amongst others. We are excited to announce the new installment of BHK Philosopher Series, which we are calling the Philosophizing in Soweto Series. With this new iteration, we hope to host an array of younger, upcoming Black scholars from all corners of scholarship who are working on what we identify as pivotal questions that have the potential to channel the unfolding trajectories of the 21st century Black radical intellectual tradition. We also hope to foreground anti-hegemonic intellectuals who are working from independent institutions of knowledge production. We firmly believe that self-driven and Black radical knowledge production is a key factor of generating and engineering what our tradition sees as the revolutionary paradigm qua blueprint, which shall channel the manifestations of a world that fits our vision of justice and power. We are thus involved in the long genealogy of Black radical knowledge producers who attempt to work against the currents of the dominant colonial discursive field and the world it reproduces and recultivates at every turn of its continuum. With this new iteration, we hope to contribute to the greater revolutionary program of cultivating an anti-colonial world-building system, or rather a program of cultivating an anti-colonial world-building paradigm that not only anticipates but cultivates a world situated for life, right? Or as Professor Mboti in his paper says, a world that has the capacity to hold life and tarnish all systems of harm. We were first joined, our first discussion, our first symposium was with the incredible and impeccable Dr. Sibusiso Maseko, whose discussion was actually quite important. And it's sort of like prefaced, I suppose we can say, the conception of white indigeneity and even the strange things we've been seeing in the international scene of, white people claiming to be victims of genocide in South Africa. Dr. Sibusiso Maseko works on white nativism and the myth of white indigeneity. You can find that discussion on our YouTube channel. You'll also find this discussion, if you want to review it later on, for your perusal on our YouTube channel. As I want to say to all of our guests that this is being recorded and it will be broadcasted. So if you do want to raise a question later on, but you want to remain anonymous, please do indicate, and we will definitely respect and honor that wish. So the second symposium for the 2025 BHK Philosophizing in Soweto Series digital events will be, or is rather, a panel discussion between Professor Nyasha Mboti from the University of Free State and Mr. Samukelo Ndlovu, who is a PhD student, a scholar at the University of the Witwatersrand. It will be chaired by myself, and it is indeed. We are investigating the rise of apartheid studies in contemporary discourse. Young scholars in South Africa have currently been rethinking the problem of apartheid, while the emergence of a department, or, the upcoming emergence of this department called Apartheid Studies at the University of the Free State, which is being led by Professor Nyasha Mboti, and a number of forthcoming special editions on the problem. This new wave of interest on the subject is pointed toward unraveling the structure of apartheid, not merely as a regime of governance or a regime of terror, as the anti-apartheid resistance movement called it, but to think of the phenomenon as a transperiodical, or rather epochal, structure of power. Historiography in South Africa has led us to theorize and designate the phenomenon as a periodical political event, which was undergirded by a segregationalist Afrikanerdom ideology of governance. However, political time in South Africa and the recurrence of the Manichaean paradigm, which serves as the undergird of the apartheid mythos, unravels that the field of power we call apartheid is far more extensive and complex to be ontologically secluded to a mere regime of governmentality and historical periodization. So we can't only think about apartheid in diachronic ways, as Foucault says. What we are looking at when we observe not just the specter of apartheid are a complex of discursive webs which have not merely interpreted, but have also reinvented the recurrent field of apartheid reification and apartheid remythification. This symposium will try to detangle central questions in apartheid studies discourse. We will ask about the utility of this discourse and thus orient our discussion on questions like, what is apartheid studies and how is it distinct from what the Wits cohort are terming critical apartheid studies? What does the discourse seek to unravel? Given our retrospective analysis in the democratic dispensation, how can we define apartheid, and can this definition encapsulate global political phenomena? How can we shape the apartheid studies discourse towards revolutionary ends? That is, what is the political dimension, if it has any? How can we use the critical tools in apartheid studies to refurbish our political and community activism? So these are some of the central questions we'll be thinking about today. But I don't want to take any more time introducing ourselves as BHK and introducing the topic and discussion at hand today. I want to give our key presenter, our primary presenter, Professor Nyasha Mboti, his podium. But first, let me introduce him, and let me also then I'll call upon Samukelo Ndlovu and introduce him then to respond to Professor Nyasha Mboti. Professor Nyasha Mboti is the founder of the new field of apartheid studies, what he calls AS, in short, which develops the notion of apartheid as a theoretical framework and paradigm for the systematic study of the persistence of harm, injustice, and oppression. His book on the subject, Apartheid Studies, a Manifesto, published in 2023, was published by the Africa World Press. Mboti is an associate professor and head of department of the communication science at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein. His abiding interest in academia is to ask and continue to ask questions that he thinks have not been asked enough. He's deeply preoccupied with issues of truth and justice and how Africa and Africans can take the lead in the 21st century in the fields of knowledge production, science, technology, and economic development. So clearly his interest and vision definitely intersect with ours, because we think that African scholarship is certainly the future and will be the epicenter of the 21st century scholarship. So Professor Mboti, the podium is yours. You have 20 minutes to present. I'll also give you maybe 5 minutes of leniency, so about 20 to 25 minutes to present and actually give us your answer of the question, your working hypothesis on what is apartheid studies and why is it relevant for our times. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Aya, for this wonderful opportunity to speak to BHK. Maybe just a mic check. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Prof.
Awesome, thanks. So if we cut right to the chase, what is apartheid studies? And I might start with a reference. There's an article that was written in 2008 by Marcus Rediker. And Rediker writes a lot about the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade and about the Black Atlantic. And the title of the article by Marcus Rediker is History from Below the Waterline. History from Below the Waterline. Sharks and the transatlantic slave trade. Sharks as in the sharks that used to feed on black bodies that were thrown overboard. Right. So you can look up that article. It's very interesting. But it's history below the waterline. Sharks and the transatlantic slave trade. So the notion of history from below the waterline, right? You are looking at history. Historians have written about history from all sorts of lines, from all sorts of angles, perspectives, and vantage points. And he chooses to attend to the issue of the Middle Passage from the point of view of below the waterline. So you can talk about history as a ship captain who is operating a ship that is packing black bodies for the Middle Passage. You can also choose to remember that history as Edward Long does. And Edward Long is that historian who wrote about, pseudo-historian who wrote about Jamaica. You can choose to write about history like Rediker does in this particular article, from below the waterline. Very intriguing question. How many vantage points can you write the history of the slave trade from? You can apply the same thinking, I feel, to reflection about how we talk about some of the key problems of the 20th century, of the 21st century. How do we think them? How do we think about these problems? And apartheid is one of them. And what is the line from which apartheid is written about? What is the line, right? So if Rediker says history from below the waterline, he's looking at history, the history of black bodies thrown overboard from the point of view of the sharks that are eating them, right? History below the waterline. And I'm proposing here that, okay, when you talk about apartheid, when you hear the word apartheid, what is the line? Are you above the line, below the line, over the line, between the line? What is the line you're using to understand this specific phenomenon? And it even impinges on the name itself. Who is writing the history of apartheid? Who is naming apartheid, right? Who called it apartheid? The name apartheid comes from the Dutch Reformed Church and from the African Broederbond. So when we use that word, apartheid, we need to remember that this history that we are talking about, is it from below the waterline of the bodies that have been thrown overboard? Or is it from above, as if you are the ship captain or Lords of London, which is insuring the slave ship? Or the British royal family, which made profits from the slave trade? How are you talking about this phenomenon? In this specific case, when you call it apartheid, does the word also contain this perspective of the Dutch Reformed Church and the African Broederbond? Because we call it apartheid without any trouble. But what is the Zulu word for apartheid? The Xhosa word for apartheid? It's obandlululo, right? And when you think about it as obandlululo, do you really think that the Dutch Reformed Church has an idea what obandlululo is? Do you think the African Broederbond have an idea what obandlululo is? And do you think obandlululo starts in 1948? Do you think obandlululo for umuntu wemnyama stops in 1994? If you call apartheid obandlululo, there's no way you are going to speak about it with a genealogy from the Dutch Reformed Church and from the African Broederbond. So when we say apartheid ended in 1994, when the TRC says they limit the harms of apartheid to what started on 1 March 1960 to 10 May 1994, from which line are they understanding this phenomenon? When they limit to a few decades, 1 March 1960, when they say apartheid is less than 18,000 victims, that's what the TRC says. When they say apartheid is less than 20,000 victims, what definition are they using? Whose definition are they using? What is the Chivenda word for apartheid? What is the Sesotho word for apartheid? What is the Sindebele and Setswana Chitsonga word for apartheid? Because if we unravel this problem, it's pushing us closer and closer to asking the same question that Marcus Rediker asked: history from below the waterline. So in my work, I've sought to say, when we talk about phenomena like this, we need to find units of analysis and theoretical frameworks that trouble issues of perspective and genealogy. For me, there are specific issues that we ought to address when we talk about phenomena of injustice, of oppression, of inequality, of poverty. And this brings me to, I have 2 slides, just 2 slides. And I'm going to be sharing them. And I hope they are visible. So just 2 slides. Here is a picture from 1960. This picture was taken on 11 April 1960. It was taken at the place that burnt down 2 years ago in Marshalltown. Do you remember when 77 people died in Johannesburg? When it was called a hijacked building. That's the term they use in the media. But this very building, this is where 77 people died 2 years ago. They burned to death in this very building. And I've been there and I've taken pictures and I've made some notes about this very building and its architecture. But in this very building, this is 11 April 1960. The same building where 77 poor people burned to death 2 years ago in 2023. This picture from 11 April is a picture of Africans queuing to get the hated dompas. These same Africans had thrown away their dompas during the defiance campaign. So this is after the defiance campaign. They had thrown away their passes, they burnt them. So even history will remember Africans burning the passes during the defiance campaign. This event is after the defiance campaign. They have burnt their passes, they hate them, and yet here they are queuing for the passes. This, for me, preoccupies, obsesses, and fascinates me. Would you queue for harm? Because the dompas is the exemplar of harm. But would you stay in a queue for harm? Would you queue for harm? Ayabulela, would you queue for harm? Right? Lutando, would you queue for harm? You have just defied it during the defiance campaign. You have bent your dompas. And here, 11 April 1960, you're queuing at number 80 Albert Street, Marshalltown, Johannesburg. And for me, this picture captures an element that I felt speaks to history from the queue line. So when Marcus Rediger says history from below the waterline, to talk about the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade, in my work, I want to talk about history from the queue line. In other words, history from the queue for the dompas, from something you hate. You hate it, you want to do away with it, you defy it, you resist it, and yet you also queue for it. What is the dynamic of the queue? What does the queue raise as a dynamic? When you queue for the very thing that you hate. And my work is preoccupied with trying to understand history from the queue line, apartheid from the queue line, injustice from the queue line. In other words, not from the point of view of the Dutch Reformed Church, not from the point of view of the Afrikaner Broederbond, not from the point of view of the commentators and the politicians, or even from the point of view of the received wisdom about what apartheid is. Because none of the historians, and most of the historians who write about apartheid, they never queued for the dompas. So even their recollection of what apartheid is written from the line of the office at Wits, or at the University of Pretoria, or Stellenbosch University. I want us to talk about apartheid from the queue line. Who are these people who are queuing for the very thing they hate? What is the dynamic about history seen from the queue line? For me, that is the essence of Obandlululo. That is the essence of the Chivenda word for apartheid, the Sesotho word for apartheid, the Tswana word for apartheid. It is when you talk about what is operative here? What is the dynamic of the queue here? Because my argument in apartheid studies is that if you treat apartheid as a unit of analysis, if you treat apartheid as a theoretical framework, you will not just talk about injustice or inequality or poverty or oppression. You will talk about them, in fact, in the context of persistence. The issue is not so much about injustice per se, or harm per se, or inequality per se, or oppression per se, or slavery per se. The issue is that they persist. Look at how many years colonialism went on. People talk about 300 years, 350 years. Bob Marley sings about 400 years. How is it possible to live in oppression for 400 fucking years? That is persistence. It is not just that people are poor. It is that people are poor again and again and again and again. The issue is persistence. The persistence of harm is what apartheid teaches us about this paradigm of oppression. When we treat apartheid as a paradigm, you understand how the issue is the persistence. that these things go on and on and on and on. And yet the world does not end. This disturbs me. Colonialism, 300 years, 350 years. Slavery, 300 years, 400 years. And yet life goes on. And yet the world does not end. And yet the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. What is going on? So I was fascinated by this. I was fascinated by the fact that when Steve Biko was murdered in the cells in Pretoria in September 1977, Kaizer Chiefs and Orlando Pirates were also playing. Graduations were going on. Things were bought and sold. Work was still going on, right? It does not mean that people do not care. It does not mean that there's no solidarity. Something else is happening. How does life go on next door when life should stop for us to deal with this phenomena, with this problem? How is it that on the day after the Lonmin massacre, what people call the Marikana massacre, how is it that on the day after life went on? How is it possible that our experience of oppression is so uneven? That is the core hypothesis of apartheid studies. I would like us to talk about the unevenness of the experience of oppression. No two people who are oppressed experience it at the same rate. This is why when some people are blocking the road for service delivery, others are saying, I need to get to work. I sympathize with you. I am in solidarity with you. I care about these same issues, but I need to get to my mother who has diabetes, who is in the hospital. I need to get to this job interview. I haven't been employed for the last 6 years. I need this job. So can you please unblock the road? It does not mean that you don't care about the struggle, that there's no solidarity. But the rate at which you experience oppression is different. Is different to that of the next person and the next person and the next person. So I'm fascinated by the unevenness in the experience of oppression. Every single person who is oppressed in the world is oppressed at a different rate. And that different rate allows us to attend to oppression on different days, on different hours, and different minutes, and different years, and different intensities. This is what we need to solve for, colleagues. We need to solve for the unevenness in the experience of oppression. In Soweto, in Protea Glen, Soweto is a township. It is a part of the architecture of apartheid. All the people who live in Soweto are oppressed. And yet people in Protea Glen will protest that people are building shacks across the road from their houses. They will drop the values of their property. We don't want Imkuku next door. Yes, I'm oppressed. Yes, we're all oppressed. But please remove your shack. You bring crime. You drop our property values. There are even parts of Soweto that are quote unquote middle class, that are better than others and so forth. I'm talking about the unevenness in how we experience the same oppression. Apartheid is the same event everywhere. In 1910, in 1510, in 1665, in 2012, when Marikana happened, apartheid is still the same event. But our experience of it is uneven. And I don't think we have a framework that has ever tried to understand this. We don't. We talk about apartheid as written in the history books. Apartheid started in 1948 when the National Party won the election. Apartheid ended in 1994 on 10 May when Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first democratic president. Okay, that is the received wisdom. And the scholars who wrote about this never wrote about this from the queue line. They never wrote about this phenomenon from the point of view. There is no theoretical framework. There is no methodology around it. It is deaths that just come from somewhere. Are you saying that when Peter Abrams wrote Mind Boy, which was published in 1947. That is not apartheid. When Ezekiel Mpahlele was living in the world of down Second Avenue, that is not apartheid because it happens before 1948. Clearly, the people who are writing about this never queued for the Dompas. They didn't queue for the thing they hated. And I'm calling for a framework and a unit of analysis from below the waterline, from the queue line. A perspective on this phenomena that looks at it from the point of view of persistence. How do these things persist? For how long have people been living in poverty? And yet the world does not end. So my work has tried to build a framework around this. My work has tried to build a methodology around this. Because my argument is whether it's colonialism, whether it's slavery, whether whatever you want to call it, the key issue is persistence. And my argument about persistence, and I call it in my work substantive persistence, to distinguish it from when people talk about apartheid in South Africa, when people talk about slavery, they talk about effects of slavery. They talk about legacies of slavery. In other words, apartheid is just a residue now. It's just little spots here and there, but it's no longer there. And my argument is no, you don't have a framework that allows you to say that. And my work talks about substantive persistence because it's not just legacies. It's not just residues. It's not just effects. It is the thing itself. And so I would like to stop by arguing that we need to look at phenomena of injustice, inequality, racism, colonialism, empire, from the point of view of substantive persistence, from the point of view of asking how do they persist. And we need to write history from below the waterline, history from the queue line, from the queue for the Dompas, history from the point of view of the unevenness of the experience of oppression. So my work in Apartheid Studies has been since about 2012, when I started working on this. I've been trying to develop a framework for understanding how oppression persists. Not just persists, but persists substantively. And my first book, published in 2023, introduces this narrative. And my second book on this, which is coming out next year, now develops the theoretical framework and the methodology. My work is an invitation, colleagues, for you to test whether this makes sense or not. It might to you, it might not, but I'm making an invitation, an interdisciplinary invitation. From whichever field you operate, if you are occupied with issues of injustice and oppression and inequality and poverty, whether from sociology and social work, development studies, literature, history, theology, I make an interdisciplinary invitation to say, let us think about this problem of substantive persistence. What is really going on? How is it that in the 1960s, when Africans were being removed from Sophia town, their slogan was, Asihambi, Onspola here, we won't live here, we are not moving. They were moved anywhere and dumped in Meadowlands. Go to Meadowlands today, and Meadowlands is home. The very place that people were saying we won't move to is now home. How does that happen? Persistence. Substantive persistence. How is it the very thing you hated is now home? How does this work? How does a township become home? How does a thing filled with harm become home? And life goes on and the world does not stop and the sun rises from the east and sets in the west. So my work is an invitation for us to explore the things we've taken for granted. Things like apartheid, things like colonialism, things like slavery, things like inequality and oppression and injustice. And I'm saying, for the life of Christ, please, let's ask, how do they persist? And let's try to understand how they persist from the queue line, from below the water line. And then we can start to talk about apartheid as obandlululo, not as grand and petty apartheid, which started in 1948 and ended in 1994. No. What is the Chivenda word for that? When did people start to experience this? In 1895, when they came to the gold mines in the Witwatersrand? In 1652, in 1910? When do you start to experience obandlululo? There is no way you experience it because the historians at vets say you started experiencing it after the victory of the National Party. And so I'm going to stop there with this slide, which is from earlier this year, where a report by the World Bank, uber capitalistic institution, where it came out with a statistic that low-income workers, so we are speaking mostly here about Africa, speaking about the oppressed, low-income workers spend about 51% of their net wage on transport. So it's people in Midlands, it's people in Botshabelo, in Bloemfontein, it's people in Kaelicha, it's people in Sovenga, in Limpopo, it's people in Kwamashu, in Kebeja, in Umtata. Everywhere you go in these places, they spend about 51% of their net wage on transport. I actually think this is more. Now, this is not an accident. This is a report from 2025. You might choose to say these are effects, these are legacies, these are residues. But I'm saying you don't have a framework to say that. That your mother and your father and your uncle is spending 60% of their income on transport. What is that? What do you call that? Do you have a framework to talk about that, to say that? For me, we are talking about substantive persistence. We are talking about the need to talk about these issues from the point of view of the Q line. So I'll stop there. I hope I did not use more than the 5 minutes that you had allowed me, and I'll stop sharing and give over to my colleague Samkelo Ndlovu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that incredible address. I will now call on Mr. Samkelo Ndlovu, whose bio I will read now. Mr. Samkelo Ndlovu is a PhD candidate in the International Relations at the University of the Witwatersrand. His research project is around race and racism in the international order. He's also one of the key investigators of what the WITS group is calling critical apartheid studies. I'll now give Samkelo about 15 minutes to somewhat respond to Professor Mboti's theory of harm as it is undergirded by what Prof. Mboti shared with us as a conception of substantive persistence and the unevenness of experience, which basically situates apartheid and its repetitive paradigm. And I'll also, ask Samkelo to expand some of the premises by sort of like giving us an insight of what the critical apartheid studies group is saying in its attempt to answer the question of why we should reinvestigate the problem of apartheid and why we should make that programmatic in our scholarship and activism. So, you have about 15 minutes. Maybe I'll also give you an extra 5 minutes to wrap up, but yeah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to the Black House Collective. Thanks, Aya, for the invitation. Thanks to Professor Mboti for the conversation. And we have spoken with Prof quite in multiple times. I think even last year when we began this project, I think he was one of the first people we reached out to say, hey, we want to begin an inquiry into this field. So my name is Samkelo, as have been introduced. I'm a student here at WITS, and I am at the beginning of a PhD project I'm based in international relations, and the topic that I'm working on is apartheid in world making after colonial empire, and I'm trying to explore how race and racism shaped the 20th century international order, and so this is a very historical study that focuses on Jan Smart as a case study, particularly how he influenced international relations. And so the questions that I'm battling with in this project is around how settler colonialism in South Africa shaped racialized world order making and international relations in the 20th century. So I enter the question of apartheid, theorizing apartheid again, and also trying to explore apartheid as a mainframe and kind of a main theme that we can kind of use to think around these questions from that angle. And so the project of thinking and reading towards critical apartheid studies, as we have called ourselves over the past few months, is tangentially connected to my PhD project. And of course, I enter from that angle. So just to kind of like give just a little bit of context, because I think what we have been doing over the past few months has been to put together some seminars, we've had like 2 international conferences, and in between that, there's been quite a lot of conversations that we've posted. So I'm going to speak to that mostly. But I just want to give some context also into how we enter this question and where we actually begin. And so I scaled back a little to Bernard Makubane, for instance, writing in the 70s. And here, Makubane gives us a sense of how the social progression in South Africa, which in this case is apartheid, the question of racial capitalism, and the question of race and class, so he calls it the political economy of that, is actually very central to the evolution of capitalism globally, the world evolution of capitalism. And he marries these 2 things together. But for me, what is interesting here is that he centers the whole development of South Africa as central to the evolution of these global movements, or this global development of capitalism. Now, this brings the second thing here, which I think is important to kind of like think around, especially when we think of South Africa. And again, we have to go back a little and think more in the turn of the century. Here you can begin in 1910, but I want to begin slightly earlier as we begin this 20th century, in a sense that, and again here, Duncan Bell puts this moment around the dream worlds of race, where there's these utopias that are coming on now at the end of the British Empire, and everyone is trying to reimagine what's next. What is the survival of this of the British Empire? How to think it forward? How to think the international forward? And Jan Smart here comes in at the center of that, and he provides some key thinking. Of course, here he's making really, really interesting cases around how South Africa here, of course, as a white country, is better positioned to inherit this colonial estate, and as a result, continue the civilizing mission in Africa. And so this is where I stay a little, and I think with some of my friends who have also joined in this thinking in terms of what was going on in Smart's mind here, because what you are seeing is a transition from the colonial empire and this new world that is emerging. And of course, we would see over time, it is a commonwealth, all imagined around the questions of managing these colonial outposts, which is the property of this dying empire. But these race imaginations that emerges in that time. And of course, I think in the recent conversation we had, we put this around Jan Smart as he envisions the state of apartheid, which obviously builds from the British ideas of segregation. And of course, in a few decades from then, we will see the Afrikaners as actually engineering this system, which in many ways becomes, it allows a state to internalize tools of dispossession. And so theorizing apartheid for us has been also tied to this moment of the beginning of South Africa, the turn of the century, the international developments and what they mean, this dialectic between the domestic happening in South Africa and these transitions that are happening internationally. I hope we all can follow. I think I'm throwing everything everywhere. And so we come to these questions of apartheid from all of that, in a sense that, of course, South Africa has these two foundings, the 1910, which Smart is very much important in, and the 1994, which is this miraculous transition. And I think a person who actually has written very interestingly around this is Roger Southall, who's kind of thinking between these two figures who are at the center of the two foundings of this place we call home. And so thinking apartheid in this moment then is a very interesting thing, because we have been obviously battling with questions of continuations, as Prof has spoken. Is this a continuation? Is this the whole thing just having a seamless thing where it doesn't stop? Or are we dealing with the afterlives? What time exactly is this? And of course, Madlingozi has spent some time around this question. I think Caesar Mpofu has also spent some time around this question. There's quite a few, I think, entries that came in around this. So we are building on all these things, but I think for us, it has been thinking across these multiple timescapes to try and figure out how can we think this beyond this limited time of 1948 to 1994. I'm going to stop there and then turn to I'm trying to share the screen. Okay. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah. So coming into this, then I think we began this group last year, and this was our first sitting around February last year, which I think was also tied around the 30 years, which marked the end of apartheid here. And there were many questions around the commemorations, and of course, so there were many things I think that we were thinking around in terms of how, though this end has been disputed, and the criticism of this end obviously has kind of brought the idea of the crisis of democracy, and then how all of this problematizes the whole ideas that give the social justice law and governance, which are kind of like themes that gives the post of apartheid a language of some sort. So I think last year we had that. And that first session we had Prof Mboti, Siabulela, and Ndumiso Dladla, which was a beautiful conversation. I think we recorded this, and we haven't posted it anywhere actually, because we didn't have any pages from there. But I think there were kind of like questions around making a case for critical apartheid studies and what it would look like, and dealing with the questions of blacknesses, the nuances that comes with the race, gender, class, and all of that. And then the second session was thinking around the new narratives. I think here we were also trying to
Samkelo, I think you're frozen. Are you still with us? Okay. It's just...
Yeah, looks like we've lost him.
Okay. Maybe let's just give him a minute. Maybe he'll come back so that he can conclude his talk. Hi, Sam, you are muted. Yeah.
Okay, I can hear you now. Sorry. So I was still, I think, trying to go through to the, yeah. So we threw quite a lot from the lessons and the comparison between the apartheid Israel and South Africa, and how both these two countries internalizes these tools of dispossession, and actually what is happening in Palestine, and what kind of new narratives that we can draw from what is happening right now, now with the new technologies and the whole complexities that seems to be playing out. And then we went into a conference around April, and I think many people kind of like came through around this. The speakers that we had, as you see there, and the questions, of course, here circled from the constitutional questions right through to the nation state. There were questions of land, also the questions of history, and it was interdisciplinary in that sense. This is a program that we had, which is very heavy also on art. I think throughout there has been a deep centering of the art as a way of thinking around these questions. So some of the papers that survived from this, I think we are still trying to see. In fact, there is a process that is trying to have this published as an output of this, something that we can look back on as an outcome of this 3-day conference. And then we staged the second iteration of this, which was a month ago, as you see here. So I think what came out of last year was that there are problems with thinking around the question of when we look into the questions of apartheid history, as we do, but center them around the nation state as kind of like this frame where we keep looking into this. And so we revisited these questions through the body. And here the body as an archive, here as a body as a holder of these legacies of systemic oppression, but also as the body as how much of it actually it carries, these century-old stories of oppression and resistance. And what does that mean to center the body as a way of thinking through and thinking with these legacies and afterlife? So quite a lot came out of this. I think we're still actually buzzing from that. And yeah, so this is where we are right now. But I think it is fair to mention also that this group, which is trying to think towards critical apartheid studies, right now it is very much experimental. We playing around with a number of ideas in terms of what this would look like. with the complexities and the entanglements that are very evident here in South Africa, and the fact that there is no one way to look into these things. And once you actually center one way of looking into things, quite a lot get left behind. And particularly these complexities is, I think it's Makubane again, who kind of like put it in a very interesting way, in the sense that the history of Black people in this country share their history with the histories of the settlers here, and the kind of entanglements, these complex entanglements that gets brought by that. I think it's something that needs more than just one way of looking at it. And I think that is where we have been this year in terms of exploring around this question of what apartheid studies or critical apartheid studies would look like. I'll stop there for now. And I think there was a question of that last question that you threw there, of why should we revisit or why should we investigate this? I think, I mean, here is something that begins in South Africa and ends for some reasons in 1994, as history, it's written that it ends, but then you have these manifestations elsewhere, when you're looking at Israel, but you're also looking at what is happening right now, the question of race at the center of everything, and how this is playing out into the international relations of the 21st century. And the revisitation of this, for us, I think there's an idea that by centering race, particularly apartheid, we can make sense of these social and political processes of our time. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Samkelo, and thank you again to you as well, Professor Mboti, for both of your incredible contributions and also the arguments that you both raise, both tacitly and quite overtly, about what your answer is to this question, or your approach is to this question. What I take from it, before I open a round of questions and comments to the House, is that it seems as if there are two scales at studying this problem. And Professor Mboti's submission is that we need to look at apartheid through his lens of persistence, substantive persistence from almost a quantum level at the unit scale of in which the system sort of like regenerates itself, and it regenerates itself in the way in which we perform existence. And in his paper, he says that this regeneration itself is incapacitated to capture human life and to structure human life. And with Samkelo drawing from Professor Makubane's, which is really important for us to reinvestigate the work of Professor Bernard Makubane, who actually works at the school that I'm currently in, or worked here, and he was thinking about apartheid not only from the lens of political economy, but he was constantly in his work drawing and tracing the architecture of apartheid way before Verwoerd and way after Jan Smuts, or at least in the 80s, he was beginning to address that question of what is Jan Smuts' legacy and legacies of apartheid from 1910. So Samkele's extensions of his work gives us a superstructural sense of apartheid from not just the level of economy, but that level that Professor Mboti was also drawing on in terms of the construction of the system from two different genealogies, split genealogies, in fact. The genealogy of the underworld or the underwaters, what, in Africa speak, they call those who are sort of, subterranean, or those who are socially dead. And also the genealogy of the architects, those who are above board and running the ship, right? So my question really is to the two of you before I open to the rest of the House. I guess I'm taking the chair's discretion, is how do we marry these two paradigms if we can? How do we marry, the paradigm or the framework rather of substantive persistence, where apartheid persists in our actual actions, in how we generate personhood, in how we generate life, and then also shows itself in what Professor Mboti is saying, an uneven distribution of experience. So in even the way that I think about myself and frame my consciousness, apartheid is at work, which is a brilliant framework, by the way. And it opens up a vast way in which we can think about subjectivity and the perpetuation of epochal systems. Because both Mboti and, Samkelo, by way of Makubane, are right, that there are different sorts of systems. There's petite apartheid, which is just periodical, it's the regime. But then there's super apartheid, so to speak, as you have with the super Afrikaners, right? There's super African apartheid, which is epochal. It's transnational, it's also trans-systematic. It varies from different kinds of systems. It's political, it's economic. It shifts constantly infrastructurally. And at the very granular level, it's in how the person comes into the world, moves in the world, and moves out of the world. So how do we marry that quantum way of thinking about apartheid and its persistence to this sort of superstructural historiographical way, where we're looking at architecture and we're looking at the ways in which the political economy of apartheid, or the transnationalism of apartheid, is sort of constructed by the different players. When I say the players, I mean the power players, the ones at the head of construction. And I'm undergirding my question here because apartheid as a term is interesting in two historical senses. When you look at that period of 1948, there's two systems that come to that unsurface. It's the system, the regime of apartheid in South Africa and the Nakba in Palestine, both of them happening simultaneously. And both of them are historically referencing Jim Crow in the South, as well as the Nazi Party and Hitler's Germany in Europe, right? And even referencing systems before that in the late 19th century and the move of the Zionists from Germany and from Europe and trying to find this new, home, so to speak. So anyway, my question is, how do we marry these two positions of looking at apartheid and in our attempt really to crack the puzzle, if that's even possible? Prof. Mboti?
Thanks, Aya. So I'll give an example. Look at how we dealt with COVID-19, right? At one moment it was a crisis that people couldn't deal with, so life had to stop. You couldn't go to lectures, you couldn't go to work, everything had to stop because it was called a pandemic. And look at how then the whole thing stopped. They changed the definition around the pandemic. They said, now people can live with it. So COVID is still there, but now you can live with it. And once you live with it, it's still there. The same thing is still there. But when you can live with it, it means now you can go back to work, you can start international travel, you can marry and divorce and go to soccer and rugby. Life can go on. So I'm giving a set of snapshots here. COVID here, how did it stop? It did not stop. They just accepted that no, now it's no longer a crisis because you can live with it. So it's not there anymore. It's not an international emergency that should make life stop. Let's use another example. When Israel started pulverizing Gaza, killing children, bombs dropping on top of children, women, destroying that little strip of land. The Cricket World Cup was also happening at the same time in the West Indies, right? You could almost cue the sound of the wickets, the bat, the six, to the sound of the bombs dropping. Life did not stop, right? It's almost like the Cricket World Cup is a soundtrack to the genocide in Gaza. The Rugby World Cup happened. The genocide in Gaza was also happening. There is a good neighborliness if we use Verfoot stem. Verfoot says apartheid is a policy of good neighborliness. And I'm arguing that if you flip that from the point of view of my framework, the framework that I develop, you see that the Cricket World Cup and the genocide in Gaza can occur side by side. You just have to learn to live with harm. On and on and on and on and on and on. And then, you continue with your dinners, you continue with your lectures, you continue with your Soweto derbies, not because you don't care. You have solidarity with Gaza, but you also need to visit your girlfriend. You also need to take your child on the school run. You also need to take your children to the soccer match or to the church camp. So, and then the last example I'll use is load shedding in South Africa. When load shedding started, everyone was up in arms. What is happening? That was about 2018. What is happening? Are we becoming Zimbabwe? What is stage one? What is stage two? Surely you can't live without electricity. Fast forward 6 months later, and people are saying, give us a timetable, right? It's now stage four. Things you were saying, surely you can't, people can't live like this. Once it persists, people impose a timetable and say, okay, tell us when you are going to load shed, right? The problem is still there. It hasn't changed. But what we need to do is to learn to live with it. Charge your phones, charge your laptops. You organize your weddings and your meetings when you know there's not going to be load shedding. So the problem has not gone away. It's our capacities to live with it that reorganize, that life can go on with the thing we said, surely life can't go on like this. My argument is, your question is, how do you marry these perspectives? For me, the framework is quite simple. My argument is, think about the issue from the point of view of the queue line, the unevenness in the experience of oppression. What do I mean by this? I'm saying I define apartheid as oppression on holiday, right? In my book, is one of the definitions that I propose. What it means is the dynamic of the queue is very interesting from the point of view of empire, colonialism, slavery, and so on. When you're queuing, Ayabulela, you see something very strange happening. Number one, you use your own money to come from the township to go and queue for the passbook. So it's at your own expense, what I call the invoice in my work. So it's at your own expense. You are the one paying out of your pocket to go to this very place where you had a defiance campaign a few months before. So number one, your own expense. Number two, when you get to the line, it's early in the morning. The line is a string of digits. It's one person after another. So conversation is very difficult. Solidarity is very difficult. Reflection on the structure of empire and the superstructure of empire is very difficult. You are there, you fill in your application form. You put in your address. You don't put your neighbor's address or uncle's address. You put in Ayabulela's address. You put in the details of your father, your grandfather. It's limiting it in a very granular form to you. You feel otherwise your application form is going to be rejected. From filling in your application form, then there's this guy who jumps the line. And suddenly the whole queue is angry. And then you appeal to the white security guard, the black security guard. He has jumped the line. Please, he needs to get out of the line. Look at how there's a sub-conflict at the level of the dynamic of the queue where black on black, so people talk about black on black violence. You are saying, Ayabulela jumped the line. Look, I hate colonialism, I hate apartheid, I hate that I have to queue for the dompas, but he jumped the line. We will talk about liberation, but don't jump the line. And then the white security guard or the white supervisor comes and says, no, you get out of the line. He was here first. Suddenly the colonizer is imposing law and order and good order in the queue. Suddenly he's on holiday. Now you're no longer fighting oppression at first remove or at the first instance. You are sorting out the queue, the person who jumped the queue. Then you have a person bribing the security guard to get in front of the queue. That's a whole new economy arising, whether in the township or elsewhere. Look at how the colonizer now is just observing. This is why in my work I say apartheid becomes undetectable. The colonizer is now observing Abantu Emnyama bribing security guards to get in front of the queue because I can't stay in the queue the whole day. So there's a new dynamic, a sub-capitalism that arises for the oppressed. And when you submit your application form, you feel relieved that I've submitted my application form for the DOM pass, that I can go. You don't stay, you don't wait around after you've submitted the application form in solidarity with the rest of the people in the queue to say, oh, you know, we are all oppressed. I'm going to wait until all of you have submitted the application. No, it's like, I'm done. My things are done. I'm off. I'm going off to other things. Each and every single person experiences that queue in terms of those durations. Those durations are different for each and every one of us. So I'm talking in terms of the dynamic that arises when you queue for the thing you hate. Right? You live in an America you hate. America is the land of slavery. You were enslaved here, plantations were here, and you're still living there. A new dynamic is created. And I'm saying we've not done enough to create frameworks that try to understand the unevenness of the experience of oppression. And for me, once we do that, we have a conversation among ourselves. We get to start to understand so-called black on black violence. Ramaphosa was in the Oval Office just last week talking about crime. Right? And now they say, oh, the problem in South Africa is crime. Right? So it's as if they're settling the issue of white genocide. There's no white genocide, but there is crime. And look at what crime itself is concealing. It's concealing that we've never had a framework to actually understand how colonialism becomes undetectable, not invisible. Invisibility is not the same as undetectable. Undetectable means it's there. It's like COVID and load shedding, which never went away. But what changed is we now have a timetable. Right? I operate in the morning, you in the evening, you yesterday, you last week. So the difference is in our timetable. In the timetables at which we experience operation is key. And so I'm going to stop there by just saying, for me, I think we marry these issues once again by trying to push our theorizing to the level of the person who has to queue for the very thing they hate, who has to live in the very place they hate, who has to spend 65 years working at the same dead-end job that they hate. The people who get on the boats to Europe that drown, they sink, and yet they keep getting onto those boats. History from the point of view of those boats, for me, is a very different paradigm. For now, I'll just stop there. But thanks for that question. It's a very a critical question, and I think this is where the invitation needs to be posed at that level.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Prof. Mboti. That answer was extremely rich. Let me take hands from the house itself. Let's take a round of hands, some contributions. Let's shift our attention to the people who are populating the room. What do you guys think of the central questions and the frameworks that have been presented to us, as a people, as a public? Because scholarship is meant to be public. It's not meant to be, enclosed in the echelons of academia. So let's take a round of hands. I see Mechi, Zwelenkani. Anyone else? I see.
Okay, I found this on the web for Mechi Ikes, William Card.
Sorry about that. Okay, so let's do Mechi, Zwelenkani, and Tabi. Maybe two more hands as discursive points.
Thank you very much for taking my question.
Okay.
So I have a question that is directed to both the speakers, because as I listen to them present, I see some parallels between apartheid studies, Black radical thought, as well as some bit of Black Marxism. So I just want to find out what is the difference between apartheid studies and Black radical thinking? And the last one is that, does South Africa ever had the program of deracialization, which was the center of white supremacy and colonialism and apartheid in South Africa?
Thank you so much, Mechi, for that question. Zweli and then Ntabi.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Prof, for the wonderful presentation. And thank you to the respondents as well. Real quickly, the submission that I would like to make, I would like to open with perhaps a quick anecdote. Not so long ago, a few years back, I went to Swaziland, and when I arrived there doing whatever I was doing, I can't mention for legal purposes, I'm sorry. When I arrived there, I found that people were wearing these black ribbons. And I was asking them, why are they wearing these black ribbons? And when they explained to me, I was quite surprised. They told me that they were commemorating a taxi accident where people had passed away. And my mind couldn't really register this for some time. I couldn't comprehend because where I come from, which is not so far away, I mean, between Swaziland and South Africa, this is, I mean, it can be on the fifth page of the newspaper on one day, and maybe on the first page, depending on how salacious the news cycle is. So I found this very incredible that people can stop to recognize the suffering of other people, the loss of other people in such a way, right? Which also brings me to something you raised, Prof, when you speak of the COVID moment, right? Because the COVID moment was really special in the way that it showed us how life can stop at the face of crisis, right? Because I mean, after Marikana, Marikana was a crisis. Yes, I mean, life was lost, but it wasn't an emergency. The xenophobic attacks before the World Cup 2 years later, it was a crisis. It was tragic, but it's always tragic, but it's never an emergency. So the COVID moment was very interesting in that sense that, oh, wow, this is incredible. And it's very interesting how all of us were then bounded together, speaking, responding, which is the last point, responding to your point about the atomization of suffering, even though all of us are suffering. But it was very interesting how all of a sudden all of us were unified by the virus, right? That, we can almost speak the virus into each other. We can breathe the virus into each other, but we don't breathe the poverty into each other. We don't breathe the pain, the violence, the trauma into each other. Everyone's is kind of atomized. So I found that very interesting. I just want to say that I'm very, 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 very grateful for and the work that you guys are doing in this field, and I look forward to following it, moving on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zoli. That point of atomization is important. In fact, I think just like the virus, we breathe, our experiences of the oppression, like these individuated and individualized experiences, we actually transmit it. And I think that's the irony and the connective point of how the structure is built according to Prof. Mboti's framework. But what a brilliant question. Let's go to Tabi, and then I will read Carol's contribution. And then I'll also ask Dr. Sbusiso Masego to maybe also pose a comment and maybe, give us maybe just spend 3 minutes telling us how this perspective, this paradigm connects with his own work on white nativism, if he's still in the house, of course. Tabi, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for the space. I just wanted to refer back to one of the mentions. I think it was Mr. Ndlovu. You mentioned what it means to center the body and how that centering through, you can work with it, to kind of talk about these things and ask the questions. I'm curious to hear more about that. As a creative practitioner in my work, I'm always curious about, certain narratives and how they're channeled, and if you can maybe link me to more work that speaks about reinstating these questions, through the lens of the body as an archive of a legacy of systematic oppression.
Thank you, Tabi. Another brilliant question, the question of the body as an archive and how this archive also registers, this forced atomization of experience and this differentiated form of experience of apartheid. So that's a brilliant question. I just want to, before our speakers respond to these questions and comments, I would like to give Dr. Sbu Maseko some, maybe just 2 minutes to, briefly speak to us about how this work on apartheid studies connects to his own work on white nativism, and if he perhaps has a question or comment for some of our speakers, because he was our, the previous speaker in our series. So Sbu, are you still with us? Sorry,
Yes, I am, Maya.
putting you on the
Yes, I am.
spot, but if Njay,
Yes.
share 1 or 2 minutes of your own thoughts and maybe give us some
Yes.
connections between, this framework, this rising framework, emerging framework, and your own framework on white nativism and its mythos.
I think for me, maybe I'll start off. Oh, thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts. I think I've got a lot of notes here, and I've got so many ideas and so many thoughts. So I'll attempt to just be very succinct and straight to the point. I think my comments. I find the prof's work very, very generative in the sense that he invites us to think of apartheid not as a historical moment, but as a theoretical framework. I think that's a very important shift, and him inviting us to sort of change our framing of the problem as something that is continuous and that exists in the everyday. So I found that aspect of his talk very, very fascinating, And in his work, I also see there's very important ideas around how somewhat apartheid in the everyday becomes sort of benign, sort of not harmful in how we live in the everyday, and then somewhat becomes malignant and rears its ugly head again at a particular moment, at a Marikana moment, or at a, Cyril Ramaphosa sitting in the White House moment. Um, so I found these concepts very, very generative. And I think some girls' work as well. I found the concept of, I think he speaks about dispossession and how, South Africa as a nation state, internalizes tools of dispossession and how this is sort of continuous. So these are very, 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 very interesting ideas. And then uh, I think my first thought, I think with my work, my work really is about how white South Africans, draw on colonial mythologies and how they peddle these in the everyday, in order to make themselves native and owners of South Africa, so that they can justify oppression in the everyday and feel comfortable in it and feel at home in a nation that is not theirs. So I think their work adds to my work in that sense, and I can draw from these theoretical the theoretical framework, of critical apartheid studies in order to, you could say, deconstruct how white settlers use mythology and continue to use mythology to locate themselves and to make themselves native. Yeah, so those are my thoughts. Yes.
Thank you so much, Sbu. I think also an intersecting point is, your work on white mythos and its nativisms, and Prof's points on the separate genealogies that actually make up, the persistence of apartheid. I think that would be an interesting conversation and an interesting interlocution. But let me see. Let me just look from the chat. Carol had a really, insightful comment here. Carol, are you still with us? Would you like to share this via audio, or would you like me to read from it? And then we will give our speakers maybe some time to respond. And if we don't have any other questions, we will then close our discussion. Carol?
Oh yeah, thanks. So I was just asking, actually just clarifying that maybe the whole system of apartheid, just like Professor Mboti is suggesting, that it has to be studied in parts instead of the whole system. So what I was hearing from the second speaker, who was basically supporting the argument is that I felt as if we're trying to study the whole and parts at the same time. So that's why it may not be clear on what is it. But it's quite interesting what Professor Mboti is suggesting, that we need to study or look or develop a framework that will help us to understand from the queue line, or from the reason why I'm interested in it is because I'm in the queue line. I relate more with the person who will, even though we hate the system, we still feed the system. So yeah, it was quite interesting, and I appreciate the talk, or the discussion that Professor Mboti gave us.
Thank you so much, Carol. That's very insightful. That it's actually interesting to study the system, both in parts and in its completion. And that's the thing about systems that operate as hydras. You just never know where to focus, and that's also the genius of evil. Something we need to speak about more seriously, but another time. Let me see. Let me give Prof. Mboti and Sam 5 minutes of response shared between each other, and then we'll take one last round and let them conclude. So Ntabi, I'm noting your hand. Tembu, I'm noting your comment. And I'll also invite Fikile and Zanele to also share their comments, and then they will close at the end. So just maybe 3 minutes between the two of you, 1.5 minutes each, to respond to some of these questions and comments, and then we'll do our second round and close. Prof. Mboti, Samkelo.
Okay, thank you, Aya. My response really is, so I don't have all the answers, and I don't pretend even that the issue is about the answers. The issue is at this stage about the questions we ask. So for me, I'd like to just extend an invitation to Zwelenkani, to Sibusiso, to Caro, to say, I really like where we are taking this, and to Mechi as well. Let's actually sit down together and let's share in an interdisciplinary space, because the problem is the silos, right? We all are doing important work on apartheid, all of us, psychologists, people in communication, people in history, literature, we are all doing important work on apartheid. But because we're doing it in silos, it looks as if the thing is ineffable. And my argument here is, I'm inviting us to actually have a framework. If we can have a shared framework, maybe we can start to deal with the issue of the silos. And I really, as Welenkani, while I would like to collaborate with you, I really like how you frame the issue of COVID, because I've written about it in my book, and I've said exactly like you're pointing out, with COVID, life stopped, the world ground to a halt. It didn't matter whether you wanted to go to a rugby match or to your child's school run, stop it because there's a pandemic. And yet, with poverty, more than 1 in 2 South Africans living in poverty, it's a crisis, but it's a crisis that can be lived with. And that changes everything. It's an emergency, but it's an emergency that can live. Life can go on. With Lonmin, the next day, 17 August 2012, life went on. With inequality in South Africa, life goes on within the gaps, that within the inequality, the gaps in between the inequality and so on. And last point, I completely agree with you about the black radical thinking. So for me, it's not even about how are they different to black radical thinking. For me, it's the view that Aime Cisse has, that there's enough room for all of us at the rendezvous of victory. So I do not see one framework as elbowing out another and replacing another. I do think there definitely is enough room for us. I just feel that the received paradigms again return to the received definition of apartheid. And that received definition is the one that leads the TRC to say apartheid, they are only going to listen to narratives from 1960. And they're only listening to a type of narrative, which they called gross human rights violation. And therein our problems begin. So I'll stop there, but I'm extending an invitation. Caro, Sibusiso, Zwelenkani, Mechi, with Mechi we already talk, but I hadn't met Sibusiso, Zwelenkani, or Caro. If uh, Ayabulela can share with me your details or share with you my details, I definitely would like to continue this conversation as soon as tonight or tomorrow or next week, because for me, it's extending the invitation and the provocations that where we need to start. Thank you. Sorry, I took more than 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Prof. It was very tight, but that's what BHK is all about. It's about connecting all of these amazing Black thinkers and Black activists and bringing them home to each other, bringing them home to the Black radical tradition. So I'm happy that you've extended this invitation, but keep in mind that we're still going to have more events of this nature, and this is not the end of our discussion. So, Prof, you're at home. These are our people, so don't worry. Let me give to Sam to respond to the question of the body and maybe even to the mythos of white nativism?
So thank you so much. I think I will first just touch on the just the idea of how exploring the structure of apartheid and looking at the whole historical evolution and placing it right at the foundations of the histories of South Africa actually allows us to observe how apartheid is actually central in the architecture of the post colonial imperial community, and how this allows us to also observe the intimacies of the colonial empire with democracy, and with all the things that emerges afterwards of how these are kind of like joined to the hip, and through theorizing this idea of apartheid right from the beginning, from its historical emergencies. So I just wanted to make that point there. So to Ntavi, I think I can share with you some works around this. I can just like email it to you, some of the works that you can look into, but we will be hosting some more conversations on the second semester. I think there's quite a few things that we looking at kind of like extending on. I think there was quite a lot that emerged from the themes of entanglement, of conviviality, which are themes that allows us to think or theorize from the body. That we're going to have a session on that. And then we also had a session on the arts, where I think we had radical others from UJ together with the Center for the Less Good Idea. And there was quite a long, very interesting discussions around that, then within the art practice and thinking around these questions also centered on the body. So I'll extend that invitation. I'll share with you those details and you can join that as well. So yeah, but thank you so much for this. I think that would be, that would be it from me. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam. Let me take one last round of questions, concise questions, and then I'll give my speakers some closing time, and then I will close for BHK, because we have so much more coming from the series, and we also have other projects. So I want to make that announcement at the end, but let me take one last round of very concise questions and comments. Ntabi, your hand is up. I'm seeing also from the chat, Tembo and Zanele have also contributed quite a bit. So maybe if you guys also want to open your audios and speak out loud. So let me take those 3 hands. And if anyone else wants, maybe Fikile as well. I'm also going to put her on the spot. So let's take those 3 hands and conclude the discussion. Ntabi, you may begin.
Thank you, Aya. I want to phrase this question gently, Prof. Mboti, not to sound as an attack. I'm curious about why you think the work that we're doing is done in silence. Curious about what platform or framework do you recognize as having the voice you're seeking out, and where we should be taking our work to work towards that integration you're, thinking about.
Beautiful question, Tabi. Anyone else who might want to speak? Let's go to Tembu and Zanele. If you guys maybe want to speak. Okay. Tembu, Zanele.
Yes, hi, good evening.
Yes, thank you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Oh, great. Thank you, thank you for the seminar. I think from at least what I've written there, I was very much struck by the idea of essentially renaming the uncomfortable, us dumbing down, I guess dumbing down the uncomfortable just for our own palatability, and taking this from what is earlier discussion. The idea that I suppose we would have to live with this discomfort, and essentially betraying our own needs, our own selves. And I had the idea of the 27th of April 1994 come to mind, where in my head I have this visual of I suppose a fighting Black South Africa, and all of a sudden it's all stopped and it's a queue and we are moving on. That's what I had in mind in any case. Thank you.
Thank you, Tembu. That's another date to note, 27 April, as much as we note 1948, 1910, 1994. How about you, Zanele? Would you like to speak out loud? Okay, I'm hearing no response from Zanele. Maybe they've left, but they've posed a question in agreement with Carol, and they say, I've been thinking about the displacement, misplacement, and replacement of apartheid systems. So yeah, it's interesting, the question of placement and regeneration. Figile, would you like to say something before we close? Figile or Sisandi, if any of you are in the house. Or Bab Mabule.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Yes, Zanele.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Sorry, there was something wrong with my audio. But like I said, I'm an art curator by profession. And I've been thinking a lot about, I am from Soweto. I grew up there, I was born there. And thank you so much for this conversation, because I also find that the older generation doesn't really talk about what they've been through. It seems like how Professor has described in terms of like the COVID, how it happened, like we got so used to things being normalized because of the persistent and the consistency in terms of the structure of the system, how has been constructed to the point that it's been normalized. And hence I put that first comment, that consistency creates normalities within our everyday lives, So that also goes to the point where I was thinking about, the displacement and misplacement and replacement. So the displacement, in, for instance, how people would have to move from their homes in the Eastern Cape, in Limpopo, to come and work in Joburg, to queue for their dorm bus and all of these things, coming into the new system and living their comfortable lives and things that they used to know. So now that's where the misplacement comes from. And then the replacement of where our homes used to be, what are they being replaced with? You understand? So those are the kind of things that I'm thinking about in the sense of like the structure of apartheid. Besides, we're talking about the fact that how it affected us, yes, from people in Soweto, but in terms of pulling it back way when it started and before it started, in a sense of how much of our normalities that we've lost during those times. Because when you look at the structure of Soweto itself, people don't do things how people in the rural areas do them. So there's a lot of context of culture, customs, everyday life that has been lost, so that even some of people from Soweto, when they go to the rural areas, how much of a difference is that in terms of like their normal state of consciousness of how they know their life. So I think for me, it's a sense of like apartheid hasn't ended. It's just that it continued and we've normalized the fact that because we are from Joburg and from Soweto, this is our way of life, but we don't understand in terms of like the distance and the gap that is created in terms of for us to even know who we are, their language, their customs and stuff like that. But I think for me, that's just what I want to dive into in a sense of looking at those things, because I think they play a crucial role for us to even understand how much we actually lost, as much as we understand the factor and the damage that it's done, but how much it's doing in the everyday life of people that are in Soweto in terms of apartheid and the system that is still very much alive. It's just that now because of the so-called freedom that we have, but in honest truth, it's just, what do you call this? As a camp that is just now, people have gotten normal too, and that's their way of life, But I don't want to dive too much, but that's where my thought chain is. But those are the kind of things that I would also like to see being discussed in terms of these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zanele. Let me give Prof. Mboti the last 2 minutes to conclude the discussion, and then I will close everything off with a few announcements. Prof. Mboti, could you respond and also maybe address the question of, how do we build intellectual consolidations? I mean, Black House is an attempt at doing that, but doing it outside academia. Black intellectual praxis, which some of our members like Ntabi and other people are here, also is an attempt of building consolidation, but with massive questions like these, like, rebuilding frameworks such as Apartheid Studies and other frameworks that are necessary in terms of generating scholarship for the 21st century. How do we consolidate our attempts and bring all of this, energy, this Black intellectual energy into, something of like a structure, a system, and in fact, an infrastructure that will enable, students who are coming up, that will enable them to do their work in as much freedom and with as much resources as we possibly can generate for them.
Thank you, Aya, for that. For Ntabi, the big takeaway I get from your question, in fact, is not the question you asked, but how you prefixed it. You prefixed it with almost like an apology and a politeness to say, "Oh no, I don't want this to seem like an attack." But I would like to say, in the space which I envision, and I'm linking this with the comment that Ayabulela made about how do you consolidate this Black intellectual energy. When we have a framework or frameworks, right, in the plural, attacks themselves do not bring the house down. At the moment, even our theorizing itself is so fragile that if you attack me, or it seems as if you're attacking me, the whole intellectual exercise is fragmented, is fractured, and Black House Soweto crashes and bends because Ayabulela and Zwelenkani disagreed. But when we have generative frameworks of the kind that Busiso was talking about and was hinting at, no, you should be fine with saying, look, Nyasha, I think what you're saying is ripe for attacking, and I'm going to attack you. What you're doing is you're falsifying my theorizing. You're saying, okay, that this is your theorizing, and this is as far as it goes, but it does not apply here and there and there, and we need a better theory or a better way of theorizing. So I completely agree with you. The fear of attacking each other is a real one, and sometimes we need to hold back, but hold back not because we should not be attacking, but because our intellectual work is very fragile. Our intellectual frameworks are very fragile. One attack, one very insistent sort of opposite approach, contrary approach, and everyone turns their backs, everyone abandons the project, or people doubt the project and so on. And I do think that partly is because we do not have enough care with our own experiences of oppression, right? This is why I am pushing very much for an understanding of the unevenness of the experience of oppression. It does not mean that therefore we are not oppressed. It does not mean that in fact that we all care about liberation. Simply the fact that Ayabulela might have a $500 shoe or dress, right? And therefore it means that she cannot be part of the struggle. Or that we have a TV in the township and next door they don't have a TV, right? Does that fragment the struggle into 1,000 pieces? At the moment, yes, it does. At the moment, the fact that such and such a person speaks with a twang or with an accent is enough to fragment the black struggle. We saw it with FISMAS 4. The smallest argument around strategy, around what to do. Should we ban libraries or not? Somebody says, no, 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 let's not touch the libraries. I have an exam coming up. There's no way. We cannot destroy these structures. We need them for the future. Someone else is going home and others are saying, but why are you not here with us? We are fighting on your behalf. We can't fight on your behalf. We all have to be here. But what does it mean to be all have to be here? Right? So my argument is I do want to see, I have a vision of a space where Ntabi should actually be able to attack my ideas without my ideas crumbling into dust. At the moment, there's a lot of fear. If I attack Ayabulela's PhD, then suddenly we have a bad blood for the rest of our lives, or her PhD becomes almost impossible in the spaces in which I walk because Nyasha attacked them. So for me, it's actually a comment on the prefix you made to say, I don't want it to seem like an attack. And I think this is where we are in terms of the black intellectual energy that Ayabulela is talking about. We are there because very little push. If Samkelo says something negative about my work, suddenly it's either, oh, are there personal issues between them? Or, oh, yeah, Nyasha's work now has been found out, and therefore. I feel that we need to create even more resilient spaces. This is where I agree with what Zanile was saying. The old people, the old generation, they don't want to talk about their Q level experience of apartheid, largely because they are still in the queue. The woman who was cleaning my office before I was at the University of the Free State in the 1980s is still cleaning that office. She is a domestic worker. She's a precarious worker who travels 60 kilometers to Botshabelo and 60 kilometers back. She travels 120 kilometers every day. Right. So, and this is why I speak about substantive persistence. She travels 120 kilometers a day. She's been traveling that since the 80s, since before I was born. I was born in 1983. She has been traveling more than 100 kilometers every day to get to work. And I'm saying the reason the old generation don't want to speak about their Q level experiences is simple. They are still in the queue. You might rename it, you might choose not to call it apartheid. We can call it whatever. But if you're still in the queue, you don't have a vocabulary for talking about your experiences. And so we are losing a huge archive, a huge corpus, because we don't have the vocabulary, because we don't have the framework. And my work is trying, I don't know if I'll succeed, but my work is trying to look for the vocabulary, for the work, for the frameworks that will allow us to mine and to tap what these older generations have, which is really beautiful, which is really rich, and which is really generative. But when you don't have a vocabulary, you fit it into existing frameworks. And those ones have already been tried, and many of them are exhausted. And then I'll close by saying, Zanele, again, I'm extending an invitation to you, because I really like what you're saying about place, right? You're saying displacement, misplacement, replacement, right? Sam Keliso was talking about the body. You are talking about place. So the word that remains in all of the words you use: replacement, place; displacement, place; misplacement, place. And the Q is in large part also about place: my place, her place, their place. And colonialism also colonizes space and place. And I'm fascinated by this. So I would like to actually invite you so that we can break these silos. These silos are a problem. You are doing important work on oppression and injustice and inequality, but you're doing it in a silo because we don't have the vocabulary. Sibusiso is doing really important work, but he's doing it. There are no pathways linking, there are no passages linking our work. And this is what I hope at some point we'll be able to find those passages that link and consolidate, as Ayabulela is saying, that Black intellectual energy that is there. So, and I would like to thank, in closing, Black House Soweto for this space, because you're creating that vocabulary that we don't have. There's so much that we can get. In our archive is so huge, but it's completely neglected. The Q level experience, the uneven experience of oppression in the townships, in the farms, in the mines, in the hostels, in the churches is huge, but it's neglected. This is why Thomas Piketty came in 2015 to UJ Soweto campus to tell people in Soweto about inequality. Can you imagine that he came? He's a rock star intellectual. You all know Thomas Piketty. He came to tell people in Soweto about inequality. I'm not going to interpret this. I'm just leaving it to you. Look about Thomas Piketty. He writes on inequality. He was paid millions to come to South Africa to speak at UJ Soweto campus to people in Soweto about inequality. And so the invitation, Zanele, last year there was a student at a conversation I had from the University of Limpopo who had a very interesting paper where he was saying we need to distinguish between the township and the Kasi, right? And immediately when I listened to him, I said, let's break this silo. I would really like to see what you have to teach me about this, because this would really enrich my work and your work. But this student had a very powerful approach. He says the township and the Kasi are different. They are the same place, because you're talking about place, Zanele. He says they look like they are the same place, but Meadowlands, as the superstructure of apartheid thinks about it, there is a Kasi in Meadowlands and then there's a township in Meadowlands. And the Kasi will allow you to celebrate the township, to celebrate life and identity in the township without celebrating colonialism. Right? This was a thought, this was a framework that we are now exploring together, that the Kasi is not the same as a township. But all I'm saying is the silos lead to us not having a vocabulary where we can speak with each other. And I'm hoping, and I already see how BlackHouse Soweto is helping to start to chip away these silos. And so thank you very much, Ayabulela, and the rest of the BlackHouse Soweto family. You are doing really fantastic, regenerative and generative work. And I hope this will continue again and again and again until, as I argue in my work, we put apartheid on trial. Apartheid has never been put on trial. So even the central facts about what it is, how are we going to know it until they are put into the record and until we put the case to them in a forensic way? So long may BlackHouse Soweto live. And thanks to the audience today and for your questions and your engagement. I absolutely love it and appreciate it. It has been an honor. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Prof. It has been an honor. And certainly we have such a long way to go as Black intellectuals, Black radicals, and Black militants in terms of building our institutions of knowledge. BlackHouse is one such example, and so are other sister partners of ours like Black Intellectual Praxis and Funda Center, where we are really trying to build consolidations and formalize these consolidations so that we do have independent institutions that are concurrent with the university and other institutions as well. And we continue to sort of spread our work and pull in Black talent in order to create a new vision for Black life. And also, as Prof. Mboti says, in the vision of justice, Black radical justice, to put apartheid on trial. And this is possible. We can really create a new world, but we need to first create institutions and infrastructure so that Black talent can really manifest this new world that our ancestors have been envisioning since what I call the dusk of modernity. We have a lot of work to do, but I'm so glad that we have people to do that work with. And it is really our responsibility, all of us in different tiers of, of where we are with our work, with our maturity, to really pull our younger scholars up and pull our militants up and build the consolidation amongst each other in our various forms of talent, in various ways in which we're building this vernacular, and never ever work in silos, because Black solidarity is something that is utterly unnegotiable. We have to work together. Otherwise, we will perish as a people. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Professor Mboti. Thank you to Samkelo in his absence, for both of you for gracing us, and for the House for such a generative and very rich conversation. The majority of you stayed till the end, which is really just something so incredible. It again just shows how important these conversations and these seminars are. We have a lot of work to do in building our institutes of ideas, those that are independent and those that also infiltrate other institutions, because that's how everyone else builds power. We build independently and then we move on to the world and we take over. It's just the game, so we have work to do. I hope all of us are committed, and all of us, can pledge our allegiance to the ancestral vow. That's the first thing. But I also have some announcements as I conclude. Please note that the Black House Winter School, Decolonial, Pan-African and Black Consciousness Winter School is happening this July. It will be happening at Funda Center, and we might also have some events at the Forge in Braamfontein. So please, please take note of that. The winter school is happening from July 29 to August 2nd. This will be posted on our social media. And the person can you please, can everyone silence themselves? So our winter school will be happening from July 29 to August 2nd. I have all of your emails and some connections, so we'll definitely share those with you. And also please note that we will continue with these series. The next one hopefully will be on the relationship between genocide and femicide. I think this is a question that is long overdue, and it is important that we discuss this as a Black radical collective. What is the relationship between apartheid? What is the relationship between histories of genocide and the new developing histories of femicide in South Africa and in Africa at large? There's so much more to talk about. There's so many Pan-African connections to make, and we are in the business of doing that. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us. Thank you to for spending the past 2 hours with us. We have a lot of work to do. Black House is the place in which we house the intellectual tradition and we make these connections. Have a great day. I'll see you guys in the winter school in July, and we will also post announcements on the next BlackHouseKollective Philosophizing in Soweto series on the relationship between genocide and femicide and how to really deconstruct this problem. Have a good day, everyone. And yeah, Izwelet.
Thank you.
Thank you.